Welcome to Generous Theology, with Chuck and Brock. The fellows are talking today from Chapter 19, by Professor Cecilia Trey-Fogli, from the book, The Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Amen. I love that characterization. One interesting possibility here is we've talked about the pre-Socratic Greeks before, and how, especially for the Milesians, Anaxagoras, as well as others, Heraclitus, and other Greek thinkers, how they were striving to solve the problem of classifying material elements. And so remember how one thinker thought everything was water and everything that was thales, and another thinker thought everything was air. Another thinker said, no, everything is fire and then water. So you had these four essences, and then finally you had this search for the quintessence, which dominated their thinking as people wanted to come up with this way to explain and unify the different aspects of material reality. What did we end up with ultimately? We ended up with the periodic table. So anybody studying chemistry today knows that we have, 120 plus elements on our periodic table today. We have some number of elements. And so where Thales and Heraclitus and others were looking for just 4 or 5, we have 100 plus. And I just want to throw out there, Chuck, that perhaps we're in the same situation. Maybe we need a periodic table of causation. And here's part of why I'm going to throw that out. Because I was thinking about this and I wrote this down. And if you write it down, that must make it more legitimate. But I just started writing down something that struck me as like truly different dimensions of things that we refer to when we're talking about change. So what is change? The first thing that comes to everybody's minds when you talk about these in philosophical circles is this idea from antiquity of tracking the movements of celestial bodies. So you have some items in the sky, some bodies in the sky that change positions in the heavens, but remain themselves. For example, the planets change, and the ancients noted that. And then you have things that change position in the heavens more slowly, like the stars themselves. And the ancients were maybe just on the edge of working with that to a significant degree because of the time scales. And then you have this idea of a change of relationship more than a change in ontology. So when you think about some of the early astronomy, it was very difficult in early astronomy to separate what we would call today the modern science of astronomy with what we call today astrology. And so you had this idea of this planet moving with respect to that planet, or moving into this cluster, or moving into this. And the ancients divided the heavens up into 12 areas, the zodiac. And they would talk about, okay, this planet is entering this part of the night sky. And so you have this idea of change. Now, let's change dimensions. That's one dimension's movement. It doesn't even have to be a heavenly body. Chuck, I pick up this stone, I hold it in my hand, and then I toss it over there. That stone has moved. It's changed positions. That's the classic stuff. That's really easy. But if you think about it, an object can move in another dimension that's not just translation, let's say. But you can have, like, remember that rock I just threw? Maybe I picked it up, but maybe in the hands of a sculptor, that rock changes in that it becomes eventually, after a sculptor works on it, it becomes a statue. So there's a change in the formal nature of the object, not only or not limited to the material change. And that really, it doesn't seem like you're going to unify the translation of heavenly bodies with this kind of movement as an object develops from being a rock to becoming a statue, for example. I just throw out a dimension number 3, even another dimensional change. You can think about a body changing its chemical makeup. And so this is what we were talking about, getting hot or cold, our teapot, burning a stick. Before we take a stick and burn it, the stick is one thing. And yet after the burning, afterwards, it is chemically something else. So that's another dimension of change. And I don't see us unifying language. I don't see us unifying across these 3 different dimensions of change with any one universal, simple and consistent vocabulary. So this theory of everything already seems out on a limb. Now, I'm just going to go a little bit further here with one more dimension. And this is admittedly a supernatural change, and it requires an a priori commitment to the existence of personal being. And that is a change in purpose. So sometimes things move or change or adjust or develop in response to a personal change in the item's purpose. And so in the old days, football, way back 50, 60, 80 years ago or so, it was very common for a football team to have one team where the same team that was on the field for offense would remain on the field for defense. And so I might be on that football team in that era, and I might play quarterback, Chuck, when our team is on offense. But when the game changes and the other team has the ball, then I don't remain the quarterback. I become the linebacker. And so something in my role, in my teleos, in my purpose has changed. And without a personal being to explain it, it seems hard to justify why such a thing should be. And this is one of the dimensions of change that really is hard for materialists to work with. And you get some of them who will even deny the role of causality or deny that there is a teleology. This is, one of the postmodern narratives. There is no overriding grand narrative. And so there is no ultimate purpose at some objective layer. There is no ultimate teleos or purpose. Now, they won't deny, of course, human agency and human perspective and a human teleos and purpose. So in other words, I'm playing quarterback and then I switch my purpose when I go on defense. They won't deny that. But how is that material? And so we run into some great difficulties there. So that's, I think, 4 different dimensions that we've talked about now. I even gotten to some of the more interesting ones philosophically. Not that the others weren't interesting, I shouldn't say. These first 4 are already indications of that bifurcation. And I really don't see a way out of this except to maybe try to come up with a periodic table of causation. So I'm going to go through the other categories here, but they get a little more philosophical. And so before I did that, I just wanted to throw it over to you to react to these categories.
And it's really interesting. We think of modern search or a grand unified theory of everything as being a relatively modern search. But I think we can see that there has been, at least in some sense, a search for that for a long time, even just in, as you point out, the unity that there was between, or at least the appearance of unity that there was between astronomy and astrology, or unity, I think, that we see or saw at one time between chemistry and alchemy. There was a sense in which I think there was this feeling that there needed to be an explanation of those things in a particular way. The other thing I really appreciated about your comments here about these various dimensions of change and how it can be very useful in arguing against folks who hold to a very extreme materialist way of thinking. I think for most of us, not all of us, that sense of a change in purpose, a change in direction, not in physical direction, but just in a change in how we think about things, our direction in life, is something that is fairly universally experienced and is experienced as quite real. And for a materialist to deny its reality and say that it's really only just in the sphere of one's intellect, and it does go against real experience of so many. And I do think that can be useful in dealing with the extreme materialist. Now, I think, as you've also pointed out, there's a postmodern answer to that, which we have to deal with as well. But it is thinking through these various aspects of change can be a really helpful thing to really get into sort of those deeper kinds of discussions about what is change and what more is there beyond merely the material.
That's a perfect segue, Chuck, into maybe this next few dimensions. So thank you. I really appreciated that. I was watching a video by Hans-Georg Gadamer, who is one of the minds I'm interested in profiling for our contemporary bright minds in philosophy/theology book. So he was a continental, I would say modern in the continental tradition, thinker, no Christian he. And his text, his work on hermeneutics is the go-to, this is what hermeneutics is, for the continental secularist. And I really enjoyed a lecture he gave on the pre-Socratic thinker Heraclitus. And of course, when you talk about the pre-Socratics, it's very difficult to just give a lecture that only involves that one philosopher. So you're pulling in all the elements of Greek thought in order to give context for Heraclitus's statements, or at least the fragments that we have of him. And Gadamer points out this thing. Now, first of all, Gadamer is not denying the existence of the grand narrative. As a matter of fact, he is making the point in this video that all of the pre-Socratics, even up into Plato and Aristotle themselves, they were all cosmologists. They were all trying to solve this grand unified theory. They were all trying to study the cosmological question. There's an important point worth talking about here, and that is, can there be a such thing as a local narrative or a partial narrative in the absence of an overarching cosmological narrative? In other words, can you have meaning at the local level if there is no such thing as meaning in an objective sense? Now, of course, one of the common arguments today is yes, you can make your own meaning, and that's maybe the school that most of today's moderns are in. But Gadamer doesn't give that up. He's drawing more into consideration than just a material transition or delta. He's adding ideas of purpose and teleos and meaning and perspective. Now, think of some of the dimensions of change here when we start to bring in the human subject as a subject in the mixture, the set of elements that make up or constitute reality. Gadamer talks about, with Heraclitus, was thinking about one aspect of change, and he cited this idea of a barley drink. And you make a drink of barley in his day where you mix, maybe emulsify the barley drink into these constituent components, and this barley drink comes out of your recipe, and it's delicious and refreshing. But if you let it sit long enough, that drink will change. It'll separate into the liquid and then the barley element. And so that's another aspect of change. What do you have when something is an aggregate thing and the subcomponents that make up this aggregate thing change versus an object being simple? And we don't say simple in a pejorative sense. We mean simple in a sense that it's atomic. It cannot be broken down into subcomponents. Further, Heraclitus talked about this eternal, restless, ever-changing flame and fire. And he thought of his cosmology of change, this flux of burning. So Heraclitus was the philosopher who thought everything was fire. And I thought that was very interesting, given this Christian idea from the Holy Scriptures, this Christian idea of God as a burning and a consuming fire. And now here you have Heraclitus, independently of this Christian concept, bringing this logos, this Greek, and he used the word logos centuries before it showed up in the Gospel of John, for example. He uses this logos word from the Greek language, and he has this idea of a rational fire. Now, one of the principles that unified here for him was that opposites go together as one. And so, e pluribus unum, out of many comes one. Now, how are you ever going to get that and use language of change in this dimension versus, for example, the barley drink or the planets in motion or even the change in purpose? One more category of change is the idea of the change over time. So Chuck, you are not the same person you were yesterday, as Heraclitus noted about rivers. In one sense, you're not the person I spoke with when we talked last week, and yet you are. And so this is where he's going with this idea. How are we possibly going to capture this aspect of you changing each day of your life, and yet retaining your identity, and yet being and remaining to be Chuck? And I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here. I'm hoping people are saying, yeah, we really need a periodic table of causality. I still have 2 more categories to go through, but let me just take a pause here and gather some reactions and some thoughts from you.